Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this budget meeting of the Oshkosh Common Council here on September 24th. We do a number of things this evening. One, we want to look at the annual financial report from last year. We're going to have a report from our auditors. We'll also talk a bit about debt financing, and we'll talk a bit about the CIP. So that's kind of the agenda for tonight. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the city manager, Mark Roloff.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First off, I want to introduce everybody to Tom Carmen. Tom is with Schenck Associates. They are our firm that puts together our annual audit. Tom's going to just go over some of the highlights of the audit and answer any questions you might have, kind of follow up on themes that were discussed last year and kind of where we are with those. So, Tom, if you would be so kind.
Okay. Basically, what I'm going to do is, as far as the annual financial report document, I'm just going to make one comment on that, and I'm mostly going to go through the management communication document, because that we pretty much have the financial information summarized in there. We've got some comments, things that we'd like you to kind of take a look at and be aware of going forward with the city. So as far as the only thing I'm going to say in the annual financial report on page 10 and 11 is our independent auditor's report on your financial statements. Basically goes through, identifies the report that's being audited. It is the city's annual financial report for the year ended December 31st, 2013. Briefly goes through management's responsibility for the financial statements, our responsibility as auditors. But essentially what it comes down to is we are issuing an unmodified opinion on the city's financial statements. Basically means that everything that's required to be included in this document for it to be complete has been included. There are no exceptions or omissions, and the information fairly states the financial condition of the city for the 2013 year. So unless there's any questions on anything else in the document, that's about the only thing I want to go through with that report. If not, moving over to the management communication, the first part of this document just goes through, it's a standard letter from us as auditors to management of the city, going over if there were any unusual items that occurred during our audit, if there were any issues or problems, disagreements that we had as a result of our audit, and basically we're indicating that none of those things existed. Pretty much the process went well as it usually does. So we have nothing to report there. And moving over to page 4, this is where we have a summary of the various fund balances, the different funds and operations of the city, with the 2013 year end compared to 2012. There's just a couple of funds that I want to focus on in this summary. The first one right at the top, the general fund, that's the city's general operating fund. That's your general budget. And what this shows in the section on the top of page 4, you have a total general fund balance at the end of 2013 of about $8.8 million compared to about $9.3 in the prior year. So your general fund balance did go down about $500,000 during the year. So you've spent that balance down. Probably the most important thing to look at, this fund balance is segregated into various components. The unassigned component, the last line under that section, that basically represents funds that you have available that can be used for contingencies, cash flow, those types of things. There are no spending stipulations or constraints on those funds. And that balance is about just under $8.3 million at the end of 2013. And I think overall what this balance gives you, generally what you like to look at is what percentage of your annual budget do you have as a reserve? And we usually recommend most places try to maintain a balance of at least 15 to 25% of your annual budget. And I think right now you're probably at about 20, so you're right in the middle of that range.
We also use a different standard that Ellers has recommended. 16%, but it's of a formula of general fund revenues. It closely follows it. It's not exact, but we're in that range. So when people ask, well, why do we have $8 million? It's for a variety of reasons. The auditors have a standard that they use, and Ellers follows what Moody's does, and they have a different standard, but they do dovetail very, very closely. And you're going to hear that 15 to 20% from even whether it's auditors or financial advisors, it's going to kind of be along the same lines.
Generally, one of the biggest reasons to have that, because there are times when, I think kind of as Mark said, people will say, why aren't we maintaining any balance? Because if we have that, does that mean we have excess money that we're holding? Well, essentially, when you look at your operations throughout the year, the vast majority of your expenses occur on a regular monthly basis. You've got regular payroll that you're paying, you've got regular expenses that you pay, utilities, those types of things. But you look at your funding sources. Your tax money, a lot of that comes in January and February of the year, and then you get a settlement with the county in August. Your transportation aid payments for road work, that comes in quarterly from the Department of Revenue. Your shared revenue payments that come from the state, which is a significant amount of money that the city receives, 85% of that money comes in the middle of November. So although you're incurring your bills throughout the year, you're getting 85% of that money 6 weeks before the end of the year. So that's one of the reasons that you need to have funds set aside, because you don't want to be in the position where you run that balance down and you would potentially have to borrow short term in order to pay your bills until that money came in. So that's why it's important to maintain that balance and to stay within that range. Because the other thing that happens is if you get into kind of a habit in your budget of spending that down, you end up with a double problem, because then at one point in time, you're not going to have that money to spend anymore. So you not only have to make up what you've been used to putting in your budget, you're going to have to come up with additional funds or make some cuts for that. So those are some of the reasons that you want to make sure that you maintain a good balance there.
And as we get into a discussion later on, there's other reasons that maintain a good balance as well. I always like to equate it to a farming household, because harvest comes at the end of the year. We harvest most of our funds in the latter half of the year, actually the last 6 to 8 weeks of the year, and that's why having that fund balance is necessary, because our lowest cash position of the year is usually around November 1st, just before we get our big shared revenue payment. 85% of it comes in the middle of November. So that's $8.5 million of that $10 million we don't get until the end of the year, and then of course property taxes.
Moving over to page 5, just a couple of other balances that I kind of want to focus on. If you look under the capital projects area, and these are all the various funds that you have set up for different capital improvement areas, including your TIF districts. And there are two balances that you have included here that do have significant deficits. The one near the top is your Special Assessment Improvement Fund. Has a deficit at the end of the year of a little over $5 million. And then down near the bottom, you get your TIF 25 that has a deficit balance of about $1.7 million. So those are going to be some areas moving forward where you want to make sure, as far as your TIF districts, to be planning for whatever you can to assist those districts with money from other districts if available, or just have a plan in place as to how you're going to manage that deficit cash balance. Because essentially what happens with these deficits is that's in effect saying if you don't have cash in those funds, you're getting it borrowed from some other fund. The majority of these deficits right now are being financed with the cash that you have in TIF number 7. So the biggest thing that we're kind of concerned about right now from an audit standpoint is if TIF 7 does additional projects, or at some point in time it will close, if these cash deficits are still out there, they're probably going to get shifted from funds advanced from TIF 50, from TIF 7 to funds advanced from the general fund. What that's going to do to your general fund is, I said, right now you have an unassigned balance of about $8.2 million. If you had to shift $5 or $6 million of your cash over to support these other funds, that unassigned balance is going to go from about $8 million down to $2 million. You still, as long as the funds continue to operate and you expect to get that money back, eventually the general fund will recover its money. But when bond rating agencies and investors in the city's bonds see your general fund balance, the unassigned portion, drop to that extent, we've seen a number of communities where things like this have happened and they've been severely downgraded in their bond rating, which if that occurs, you know, I think because of a lot of the capital improvement projects and things that you're doing, if your bond rating goes down, you're going to pay a higher interest rate when you borrow. So that's just something to keep in mind going forward.
Can I interrupt you for one moment, Tom? And I'm sorry, it's actually a question for our city manager, but is that deficit that exists then in TIF 25, is that related to just a non-payment of property taxes, or why is that?
No, not at all. No,
Why
this
is that
has to do with
substantial?
the cash balance right now is a combination of two things. One is we gave an upfront grant to the hotel of $2 million, and we spent, actually the deficit is more due to over $1.5 million we spent for the Riverwalk portion of that. So that fund balance is only one, even though Tom's pointing out that one is being the most, right now stands out as being the worst. It really isn't the worst because that one is generating tax increment, and it will eventually come out of it. Tom's concern is really more of a timing issue. When is it going to turn around? It's not that one because the hotel is doing well, and for all practical purposes, it's going to be okay, but it's generating, and we were just looking at this today in anticipation of Tom's discussion. In the case of TIF 25, we're generating about $142,000 a year in tax increment. But for 10 years, we're making payments of $240,000. So we are in a cash flow negative fund balance situation or operating situation. As that hotel goes up in value, those things will improve. With that said, we do have a pay-go TIF with them, but the $2 million has to be satisfied before they can start getting that. So they're not going to get anything else until we turn that corner. But the Riverwalk is part of that. We can use some of the other TIFs in that area, specifically the city center TIF, to perhaps pay for some of that, but that's a concern. But the ones that Tom isn't even talking about yet, but I know he knows about, are some of the other TIFs, specifically TIF 20 and 21, both sides of the river, Marion Road as well as South Shore. Those are ones, even though they don't show a negative fund balance, those are of equal concern because we've already transferred money over from TIF 7 into those funds to bail them out. So they've been doing, their real financial situation is somewhat masked by the fact that we've been using TIF 7 monies. The real issue is TIF 7 closes in 2017. So between now and 2017, we need to make sure that those funds, whether it's TIF 25 or 2021, we got to make sure that we've got a plan to get them back on track to be, for lack of a better term, self-sustaining. Right now, they're not there. That's why it's important to take a look at those TIFs when we get development projects. Are they going to generate enough tax increment to get themselves on their own? We do have a plan that we're going to exhaust most of TIF 7, but we have to make sure that when we do, and that's the plan. Our plan is by the end of the TIF project, that $15 million that you see on page 5, we'll go down to between $0 and $1 million, and then it'll get distributed. But what happens after that? Because TIF 7 is going to be a very good benefactor to these other TIFs. But come 2018, when it's generating zero tax increment because it's closed, that's when we have to say, well, now what for these other TIFs? And that's probably as concerning, Tom, as anything. It's what happens after our sugar daddy no longer exists. And TIF 7 is effectively the sugar daddy of all of our TIFs. And don't want to be blunt about it, but that's what Tom's saying in very polite accounting terms.
I guess that's basically my point in this whole thing. You do have time to plan this out, and it's going to be important that you do, because it isn't going to be something that you're going to be able to take care of in 6 months. It's going to take some planning. So that's why we just want to make sure to point that out so that people understand what the situation is.
Why don't you, Mark, can you talk about the special assessment?
Special assessment, the good news, start off. At the end of 12, we had 7.7 million. It's down to 5 million. That's good news. There are projects that they're still closing. Thomas suggested that he's aware of some practices that have been done to help close that quicker, and we're going to be having discussions with Tom about what we can do with that. So Tom and Tara have already talked about it.
Some of that is citizens taking the 15 years on that too, isn't it? Them paying it up front?
I don't want to blame it on that.
No, I'm not saying blaming, but they're using that option, and
Are
that's,
reassessments in there as well? If people are contesting their original assessments and we have to go back, like we had that on the agenda last night, is that included in that as well?
That is in there, but they've already been billed, and even when they're contesting it, I believe they have to make payments. It's weird that they still have to comply with the law until the law tells them otherwise. So it's not necessarily those. First off, it's about us getting the bills out.
yeah, and I think we directed, was it last year or year before?
Yes, you did.
Within a 2-year, 3-year
And that's where
period?
you've seen the catch-up, but I still think we have a ways to go.
Yeah.
And now that Trina's on board, we're going to be working to help Public Works get those bills out, because it really is at its core, it's a basic receivables issue that we need to work on internally, improve our process. You can see that with a little nudging, we improved that by $2.7 million, but we got to get that down more. In the past, and this is talking with Ed Noakes, in the past, what we did was every few years, if this fund balance got too low, we did a borrowing and just threw $1 million in there just to keep it solvent. Peggy and I never did that in the 5 years we worked together. We knew that was out there. We knew that Ed had done that in the past, and we hadn't gotten to the point where we wanted to do that. We wanted to get the bills in first to see where we were. We're getting close. We're not there altogether, because the other culprit is that since 2010, when we started ramping up our street projects, when we ramp up streets, we ramp up special assessments, so our receivables grew by that as well. And we still are getting cash flow from when we weren't doing a lot of projects. So the cash flow coming in is a little lower, and the bills are much bigger. That's why you also saw a spike. So it's a combination of those two factors, I think, are more than just 15 people on the 15-year
Yeah.
plan. It's like now we have 20 people on the 15-year plan, but only 5 people are paying off, and that's where you run into that cash flow issue. I triggered a question from both of you at the same time. So,
How do we treat those people or those assessments that are being paid off over 10, 15 years? Are those treated as an account receivable? And
they're all here, and that's why we have a negative fund balance, because they're just
I guess
receivables.
maybe I should explain so that everybody understands how the accounting for that actually works. This fund, the receivables are recorded, but it's set up as a receivable. If they're on a payment plan, it'll be a receivable, and then it's set up as a deferred revenue. The fund basically operates on cash in, cash out. So what happens is, you do a project, if you do a $2 million street project, you paid the contractor the $2 million. And then you're going to assess that. So when those bills go out, and that's where you want to try and get those out as quickly as possible, because you will get some people that will pay right away, and other people will go on a payment plan. If you pay right away, you're getting that cash back. If you go on the payment plan, you're only getting the cash back each year as the people pay. So you essentially have a deficit. The deficit is the result of you've paid for the projects up front, and you're waiting for the people to turn around and pay you back. So eventually, it's kind of like what Mark said with the TIF districts. Eventually, they will pay off, but in the meantime, you have this gap between the cash that you've paid and the cash that you've collected.
What
Isn't
about
there-
those, there are individuals in town who historically do not pay large property tax bills. Does that show up as a receivable? Or
If it is a property tax amount, you will get settled from that by the county. The county will reimburse
County
you
holds
for
the bag.
that.
That's after
and
3
they-
years,
No, that's immediate. That's done in August of every year.
Oh, okay.
County holds the bag on those delinquent taxes. That's the county's downer in all this. They really do hold the bag.
We get reimbursed by the
We
county.
Yes.
get settled up
In Au-
in July, in August, yeah. We get set up after, even if we're owed, the county is now owner of that IOU. And that's why the counties sing the blues so much, because they're the ones, they use the
3-year cycle.
Yeah, they use a 3-year cycle, and they're holding they got a heck of a receivable out there, but we're made whole on the property
That's
tax.
state statute.
yes.
Oh, the county will remind you of that. Mr. Peck's probably familiar with that from being on the county board.
Do we have enough manpower in Public Works to get the information so that the residents can even be billed?
I think what Tom wants to suggest is a change in process.
But that's what I'm saying, is the process, I mean, I understand what Tom's saying, I think that was the message that I think we sent you last year, but do we have the capabilities within Public Works to do that?
I think between Public Works and Finance, I think we can get it done. Tara's been aware of it for some time, Trina's aware of it, and I think we know what we need to do.
Well, isn't some of that a software upgrade? I mean, you're looking at some software upgrades too, though, right? That will enhance maybe some of that billing? Or
That'll
at
help a
least-
little, but it's a matter of getting it to the point where we put it in the system. It's the methodology that we use. And we want to make sure that we're following all the laws and everything. And I think we've been following the laws quite well. In fact, I would argue maybe we've been following the law too well, being too careful, rather than just being more saying this is what these are the assumptions we're going to make. So I think it's a process improvement issue that we can work together and get that on. And I think part of it is we already did it. The 2.7 million improvement is due to that. But can we do better? I think we can do even better than improving on the 2.7. I'd like to see this chopped off another 2.5 million by year end. We did a lot of them this time. We're still short on a couple. We got to get those in because the council did give me a directive, and I think Councilor Herman asked me, is that enough time? And I said, I think it's enough time. I believe it was 2 years. I think that's adequate time, and I think we can get that done. We got to do a better job, though. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it.
But the more negatives we have on that, in that area, the more that affects our bond rating, all right?
Yes, that, and,
Moody's has brought it up.
well, I'll just say, because I know Tara and Trina both were at a conference that I was at last week, and there were representatives there from both Moody's and Standard & Poor's. And they made it pretty clear that it used to be, all they would do is, they would pretty much look at your general fund and see, well, what's your general fund balance look like? What they found over the years is that the general fund isn't telling the entire story, because there are more and more places that are having distressed TIFs and things like that occurring in other funds in the municipalities that they're looking at. So they're more aware and alert to look for those types of things, and then they will start questioning it. And I think the biggest thing is to make sure that you can respond back with some type of plan, that you are aware that it's there, this is what we're doing going forward to take care of it. And then they're going to want to see that that follow-up does occur and it does get better.
Let me just ask a couple things to find a difference here. As I understand now, the special assessment, basically there are receivables against the special assessment, so it's a cash flow. Correct? So at least there are receivables against it in terms
Yes,
a
there would
balance. If you were to have a balance sheet, you'd have a,
Right.
you have an asset
If
receivable.
all of those were collected as of the end of the year, you wouldn't have an issue there at all.
Okay, I just want to show the difference here. But they're receivables, so from a balance sheet standpoint,
Yes.
they're okay. It's cash flow, which we gotta, that's big to us. Whereas 20 and 21 are really, it's a development issue, because there really aren't receivables on those as we look forward. So the longer-term problem there on the South Shore isn't receivables and collections. It's how quickly we get it developed. Is that correct?
the reliable-
So in some ways, that's a bigger issue than, you can deal with cash flow in a variety of ways.
We can fix the special assessment one with some management improvements. Management improvements won't fix 20 and 20.
It's got to be development issues.
It's
So
development.
So those are kind of different kinds of
Right.
problems. So as we look to the future, this is in some ways a really big issue.
Throw in staff and process improvements will fix the special assessment fund, but the 20 and 21, those are not as much in our control, and those are scarier to me because
Go
they're
EDC.
not as, it's go EDC, it's being cautious about spending money out there, taking minor steps with the Riverwalk, that's part of it, and being cautious about when we do approve a development, making sure it gives us enough value that it gives us tax increment back that's good, which I think is a discussion why we're having a Riverwalk visioning. We want to make, or riverfront visioning, because we want to make sure if we're going to get a development, it's going to pencil out in the black for us.
But it's only been, what, 2 year that we had the TIF policy in place now? About a year?
Yeah, but it really goes back to, it's not just the TIF policy, it's people wanting to take advantage of the TIF policy.
True.
And that's still a slow process.
One question, I think, for Tom. When we're looked at by Moody's or S&P, how do they view a community that's allowed their property values to steadily decline?
What's happening, and you're not really alone as a community where this is occurring. A lot of it does relate to these TIF areas. What's happened over the last 3 or 4 years, when real estate was booming, the values on these properties went up accordingly. Now what's happened is, as the economic boom for real estate has gone down, the Department of Revenue has gone back, and they've revalued a lot of these areas. I've seen communities where they've had TIF districts where the Department of Revenue came in and said, well, based upon what we see as the general economic conditions, the value in that district is now 25% lower than what it was the year before. And place that at a $20 million increment on a district, increment value, it went down $5 million in a year because the Department of Revenue changed the valuation on it. You know, so if you've planned your district and you've established your debt based upon the original assumptions, and suddenly that goes away, that really changes what you're doing. And that's part of it, is value issues. And it's just, you know, the competition for economic development and growth, everybody's looking for things out there. There really is no magic answer as to how you draw somebody into your community as opposed to somebody else. You want to try and make your area as attractive as possible, have good utilities, a stable tax rate, those types of things that you can try and attract businesses in, have properties available where, you know, people can relocate. And I think those are things that you're doing. And kind of what's happened in a lot of communities too is people had been establishing these areas in TIF districts to accommodate growth. And then when the economic downturn came, you just lost 3 or 4 years because nobody did anything. But you still put all your improvements in. You're still paying on your debt, but you don't have anything there. And it's taken a lot longer for some of this stuff to turn back around. So that's kind of the struggle, that you're not alone here in having that happen. there's a lot of communities where that same thing is occurring, where the values are slowly going down, and a lot of it is just because of how revenue is valuing the properties.
Well, we move forward then.
Okay, the next few pages just go over utility operations. I don't know if there's anything, if anyone wants to go over anything with any of the specific utilities, we can. I think overall the operations are going pretty much stable and as expected. And the only other thing that I have is starting on page 14. We've got two comments to consider going forward. First one on page 14, and I think we talked about this last year also. One of the funds that the city maintains in its records is called a permanent fund. And what's included in this fund is a combination of a lot of donated funds that have come into the city over the years. I think as we're pointing out here, there are about 50 individual accounts that make up this fund, and a lot of it's for library, museum, zoo, those types of things. The total amount that's in there at the end of the year is $8.3 million. And we've got a couple of different issues. I think there's probably three big issues that are relating to this area. And the first one is, as we're pointing out, permanent funds, if they're to be properly classified as such, those are in effect endowment funds, where people have given you money, and that endowment should stay intact, and you're basically working off of the interest that you can spend for projects. A lot of times where this occurs, most commonly in communities, will be cemetery perpetual care funds, where you have a cemetery, when you sell your cemetery lots, or if you have a mausoleum, you sell crypts. You want people to put down a certain amount of money, and then the investment earnings are supposed to take care of the maintenance for that in perpetuity. In looking at a lot of the funds that you have now, those just seem like general donation funds that have come into the city. Some of them are very substantial donations, and you're fortunate to have people in your community that are making those kind of contributions to your operations. But that's why the first thing that we're looking at is to say somebody should really go through and determine, are each of those funds really permanent endowment funds, or are those just donations that someone has given to the city for, and it can be for a specific purpose, but as long as you could spend that entire donation, it really isn't a permanent fund. It should probably become a special revenue fund, where it would be typically what places will have, and it would be a library donation and gift fund, museum donation and gift fund, and you kind of accumulate all those individual accounts by those types of purposes. So that's the first item that we have to take a look at that.
Just a quick question. Do we know the
Oh,
answer to that question?
Oh, yeah,
How much?
well, I can tell you that
Just in general, though.
we've closed 27 accounts that Tara's been working on over the last few months to pare down these accounts, because I think the intent was that somebody makes a donation and the thought was, well, we need to keep a separate account for that donor, and the truth is we don't, because they are more general. So we're closing those out a lot more. It's actually going to be much easier from a management standpoint to maintain fewer funds, and we can still account for them through another method without creating a bunch of excessive funds.
The question I have, do we know out of the 8.3 million, whatever, how much is a permanent endowment? We're playing the interest versus donation?
Well, yes, in fact, we
It's
know.
about how much is the permanent? Because the permanent is the problem, potentially.
I don't know the answer, and I don't know if you necessarily know the answer. I think you're just suggesting don't make a permanent fund for something that's not a permanent.
That's right.
Right.
We're
I'm just
we're
trying to
just
figure out
saying
what the
to
8.3
take a
is
look at
compared
it,
to.
investigate it, so that you can properly report what's there.
I just figured,
We can
how
probably
much of the
get it for you.
8.3 is already committed?
Yeah, I don't know the answer. I don't even know if you know off the top of your head, but I think it's something that we can find out fairly easily. We've been more working on the bigger issue of getting these funds boiled down because there's just too many of them.
Some are in excess of 100 years old, like the Hicks money. That's what, 1911 or something, and that's still substantial.
Well, so can you
The
turn some of
museum
these
has
over
$2
to like a
million.
community foundation if they're an endowment fund instead of the city
that's-
maintaining them? Or is it based on how they're
That's
worded
what
and
you-
given
that's
to
what
the
you would
city?
have to look at how it's established. If it was money given to the city, and the city is supposed to be the custodian of those funds, then you have to follow the state statutes for cash investments.
Yeah.
So you couldn't, and that's part of one of the other comments that we have here. A lot of what you have are stocks and bonds and things like that, which would typically be unallowable investments under the statutes. Right now, they're providing you decent returns, but if you go back a few years, you probably lost 20% on.
Well, that's what I'm wondering, if we turned them over to the community foundation, earmarked back to the city to be used on city projects, would that be a better way of handling the funds?
What you would have to do is you would have to give control of those funds to the community foundation. Kind of one of those, and the community foundation is probably full of a bunch of not-for-profit organizations that have similar issues. What it is you transfer legal title of those funds to the community foundation, kind of with the understanding that they will provide money back to you for those types of projects. You have to understand that they have no legal obligation to do that. For the most part, I don't know that we've ever seen any community foundation not follow that guidance. But if there would be issues at the community foundation where they would have poor investment returns or whatever, they really don't have any obligation to do that. That's one of the drawbacks of going that route.
Okay.
The library board recently approved sending some funds over to the community foundation, and they're required to follow the guidelines of investments that are by statute. So their community foundation understands that, and they're doing those things. Museum board, the Duro Trust, which is about $2.7 million, that's with Associated Bank. They have limited limited options for investments because they can't be investing in stocks and things like that. So Associated Bank holds them in very conservative type of investments that are they're more liquid.
Funds.
Even within mutual funds, very limited mutual funds, because they're just not.
The thing to keep in mind with that, you can invest in mutual funds of government securities. That's how the statute was written, because you can go out and buy individual U.S. government securities. You can go buy bonds of the school district if you want, or any other community, or state bonds. You can buy those. They also, when that statute was put in place, they allowed you to invest in mutual funds of those same types of securities. The thing to keep in mind with that is a mutual fund. If you go out and buy a $200,000 bond and hold it to maturity, you will get $200,000. If you buy a bond mutual fund, you are subject to the fluctuations of the bond market for mutual funds. So just because you put $200,000 into a bond mutual fund of, Ginnie Mae, Fannie Mae securities, something like that, there is no guarantee that 6 months from now you will still have that money left, because you're subject to the fluctuations of the market. So I also like to point that out so that people understand that, because it is an option, but I don't think it's a good option. If you want to buy those types of securities or invest in those, you're better off buying them directly, because you will be guaranteed as to the principal you're getting, but you're not guaranteed any principal in a mutual fund if it's made up of those securities.
Anything else, Tom?
I think the other thing that you mentioned, Mark, because the other comment that we had relating to this issue was the number of individual accounts that were being maintained. There's if there is an investment account for these funds, there's also a bank account that receives interest in things out of those investments. So you've got all these individual bank accounts out there. So it just was a lot of work to maintain this. So that's why, we think the whole process could be streamlined and made better, probably provide better reporting or more efficient reporting to everybody with a whole lot less effort. If it's just reviewed and kind of cleaned up a little bit.
It's an old habit, and, when Tom mentioned cemeteries, I had that situation with a cemetery years ago, but that person gave this for this purpose, and there's this belief that you have to have all these separate accounts. Well, using a household analogy, it'd be like you having a checking account for your mortgage, a checking account for your groceries, a checking account for your utilities. You don't need all that. You can keep track of those things, and we probably just went a little overboard. So, but isn't it 27 accounts that you've already eliminated, Tara? 23. I'm sorry. Well, it's been an easy week for her. But that is a huge improvement, and they were just unnecessary. We can account for them. We can be if the donor came back 100 years from 100 years in the past and said, "Are you taking care of our funds?" We can clearly show it. That's not the issue. But in fact, I think we were probably overboard. Yes, we can show you the exact account that we've never changed since 1914. It's a little overkill. 11. All right. Thanks.
On pages 15 and 16, just an informational comment. Since the city does receive federal and state funding, you are required to have what is known as a single audit done every year, where as part of our audit, we'll go through and look at and test your compliance with how you're spending the transit funds, community development block grant funds, those types of things. And we actually do have a separate report that's issued for that purpose. And I will say there were no compliance items that we noted during our audit that we were required to report. But this is just an informational comment saying that there's a new directive that's come down from the federal government that is changing a lot of those single audit requirements. It's not really going to have all that much of an effect on the city. What it's done is it's raised the thresholds as to when you need to have these audits done. That's one of the biggest things that's in there. Since you always receive transit funding and block grant funding, you're always over the limit anyway. So that isn't going to make any difference. But it's just something that we wanted to put in to make you aware of those changes are out there. That's pretty much all I had, unless anyone else has any other questions.
Questions? Thanks, Tom. We appreciate you coming down. and
Thanks,
spending
Tom.
time with
Thank
us.
you.
Okay. Now we're going to start a PowerPoint presentation just to go over borrowing sources for the capital improvement plan. A lot of this is similar to what we talked about last year, but we thought it would be beneficial to refresh your memory on some of the funding sources and just generally how they're done. The discussion that Tom had does have value, even though I was like, gosh, we went longer, but I think some of Tom's points were very relevant to some of this presentation. So Trina's going to start, and then we're going to go back and forth as far as this. You all have the PowerPoint presentation in front of you, so you're welcome to watch on the screen or watch in front of you. So Trina, why don't you take over?
Okay. So you've all received your CIP book now. As in previous years, there are several categories that are included in our annual CIP. We've got the comprehensive street and utility improvements, comprehensive streets, new development, other streets, other utilities, stormwater, wastewater utility, water utility, sidewalks, traffic improvements, park improvements, public property improvements, non-utility, public property improvements, utility, major equipment, and tax incremental finance district improvements. So these are all categories that you'll notice that have been totaled, and you can find specific pages in your CIP book related to all of these categories. There are several funding sources for our annual CIP. Many of them you're all aware of, but we'll go over them briefly. The annual general fund tax levy, developer contributions, general obligation debt, special assessments, state federal grants or funds, joint funding with other agencies, utility funds, utility debt, tax increment funds, and donor TIF funds. The one that I will note, the annual general fund tax levy, this has been a practice for at least the last 2 years at the city, and we have designated funds through the annual budget to directly apply against our CIP.
But as Trina points out, that's only been in the last 2 years, and we have not been using a lot of cash, whether you call it a down payment or certain things we just fund with cash. That has not been something that we've done. So in practice, unless there are direct expenditure offsets or cash contributions, we pretty much fund our fund capital project, or the city has to fund the capital projects until the revenues are realized. Some of the examples, special assessments, we just had this discussion. When we use special assessments, we don't borrow for those special assessments. So we're we created a negative cash flow in that fund by the nature of how it was set up, because we agree that we'll fund it, and then the idea is that the inflow from old projects will take care of any increase in new projects. But the reality is, the last few years, we've been doing more borrowing or more special assessments, so we have to fund it effectively more. So that's one. Grants, we have to cash flow grants. Grants, we get, the receivables on the grants are very good. They're very reliable, but they sometimes take a whole year to get that all taken care of. For example, the James Road pond was funded in part by $1 million grant from the feds. That was a community development block grant fund, as Tom had pointed out. That was one of those that triggers us for a single audit. Well, it took several months after the project was verified before we got the money. Have we got the whole $1 million yet, Steve? Do you know? I don't know. Yeah, we probably have by now, but there's a cash flow float there that you got to deal with. It's not as challenging as special assessments, but we get the money eventually. TIFs are the tough ones, and the mayor pointed that out, because it's all based on development occurring. If we don't get development occurring, that we don't see the money coming back to us, and that is a huge problem. In the 90s and the 2000s, when the industrial parks were going gangbusters, you weren't even having this discussion as a council. You didn't have to. The money was flowing in, and we didn't have that problem. Cash flow-wise, even for underperforming TIFs, the TIF 7 as well as the other ones were doing so well, it was almost a non-issue. Now that TIF 7 is seeing its sunset on the horizon, we've got to start thinking about those things. So they take years to realize, especially in those redevelopment areas like the South Shore, and we know that. When you take a look at a TIF plan when it's initially put together, it shows that it goes deep into the red before it emerges. Well, we've gotten the first part down very well. We get into the red fairly quickly, and you saw that when Tom pointed out TIF 25. That one we went into the red. We'll emerge out of it. The debt's got to be paid out over 10 years, but we're going to get the tax increment over 20 years. It takes a while for us to emerge out of that. So that's just something that we recognize we have to do.
Mr. Roloff, that's not the case. So right in a strictly pay-go TIF, like TIF 27 that we just did for Perfect Seal, that's I mean, there the cash is being provided to the beneficiary of that TIF after the revenue's already come in for it.
Correct. And probably even better one, because it's on its way, is the one for Oshkosh Corporation. That we ensure that we've received the money by August, and usually by September they get the check. But we verify that they have paid in, and we don't disperse any more than what's been paid in. So those ones, the more recent ones that are pay-go, those are not a cash flow issue at all. It comes in and it goes out. The ones where we put a big investment in infrastructure, yeah, we have, those are the ones that are challenging. They're more risky, higher risk, higher reward, but those are the ones that we do to create jobs and achieve downtown redevelopment. They're very important to do, so you take that risk with the expectation that the reward will come, albeit a delayed, a deferred benefit to that. If we don't have direct cash funding a capital improvements, we got to go to debt to fund the CIP. And that's essentially all those resources that Trina showed. We'd like to use all those resources, but the reality is borrowing is more common than not. So that's why we've been using debt as a funding mechanism to cash flow. So just basic forms of debt. General obligation debt is the one that, as Tom mentioned, gets talked about the most. And that's because that's the one that funds the streets and funds the very basic services. Bonds are typically paid out over 20 years. Notes are for 10 years. And that's usually based on the type of purchase we're talking about. If we're talking about a street project that has a life of a minimum of 25 years, can go as long as 50 years, 20 years is totally appropriate. When you're talking about equipment, fire trucks, things like that, even though the fire truck has a life of 20 assigned to it, you don't want to borrow exactly for the life of it. We typically borrow for 10 years for those things. That includes general obligation debt, also includes not just bonds or notes where we use Ellers or something like that. It's also for funds borrowed from the state trust fund loan. And we've done a few of those recently. WRS is one of them. TIF borrowings, if it has a potential private benefit, we typically use a state trust fund loan because we cannot use tax-exempt debt for private benefit. That's in violation of federal laws. And then, of course, we got the other utilities, depending on the same length of time, depending on the utility. Water, sanitary sewer, stormwater utility will borrow for 20 or 10 years, depending on the nature of the improvement. Oh, and I just took you. I'll keep going. General obligation debt. It's backed by the full faith and credit of the city. Tax dollars are pledged to ensure repayment. So once you adopt a resolution that you're going to do GO debt, you are committing the city and its taxpayers to paying that debt back. It is the most reliable debt. It's widely recognized, widely available. Why? Because tax dollars are pledged. I mean, it's a pledge you're making that you're bound by. The upside of it is it's the lowest interest rate. It's tax exempt rates, and it's also because it's a governmental entity, we have a reliable cash flow for it. The likelihood of repayment is very, very high, so we get the best rate. It's a funding source for other debt, and that means if we have to fall back on something else, if this is our borrowing of last resort. If we can't use a revenue bond, or if we can't use something else like that, we'll use GO debt.
What's the current debt rating? AA2?
We're AA3.
No.
We just got that downgrade. A lot of communities did. I'm still happy we're in the AA rating category. With the rates as low as they are right now, we're talking probably 10 basis points or 0.1% difference between AA3 and AA2. But still, 10 basis points is still 10 basis points. I'd prefer to have a AA2 rating. But as I've said previously, given our situation, I think we've done the right thing to borrow when we did. I think we invested at the right time. And now that we've got other borrowing policies we're looking at, I think we're on the right track. Some other types of other uses of general obligation debt is really what I want to talk about, because we haven't just used general obligation debt for general fund type of operations like streets or fire trucks. You can use it for special assessments. We have not done that in at least 6 years, and that's something we may need to do to bail ourselves out if we got to recover a little more. We got a $5 million deficit. If we look at it and we feel that we need to borrow, that may have to cut into our borrowing. And I'm not proposing anything to borrow more than the 11.4 that the council has talked about. It's just that it may have to come out of that. TIF projects, if it's not a TIF that's cash flowing right now, we got to borrow for those. And in reality, we made a lot, when I say we, I mean collectively, we, the city organization, the city council, and not just the 7 of you, but all of your predecessors have made obligations that now are solely your responsibility, solely this staff's responsibility, but we have to recognize that those obligations are out there. And I think that's really what Tom was getting at. He just said it a little differently than I'm saying it here. It's an alternative to revenue debt if we have debt capacity and the rates are favorable. We've done that. We have used general obligation debt for utility debt in the past. Quite honestly, I would prefer to do that because you do get better rates. But the reality is when we were going after a lot of street capital projects and needed to do redo the central garage, that was something that we had to move our utility borrowing into utility debt, and we're almost exclusively using general obligation debt for that purpose. And then capital outlay items with an economic life of over 10 years, we're allowed to use GO debt, but I think the point we're making is when it's 10 years, I don't know if that's something we necessarily want to do. That'd be like saying I plan to keep a car 7 years, so I'm going to go 7-year financing on the car. Yes, you can do it, but do you really want to do that? Because that might catch up with you. So when GO debt's used as these examples, it cuts into our debt capacity, and I think that's why we're over 70%. And it may eventually compete for traditional capital projects, meaning that if we're doing TIF projects and you have to use general obligation borrowing, that's competing with the traditional GO borrowing, streets, public building projects, as well as the financing of other long-term obligations. So those are things that we have to consider when we use GO debt. So speaking of over-reliance on GO debt, we're over 70% for a variety of reasons. We've had a very aggressive street and stormwater program. We have shifted utility debt to revenue bonds to offset that reliance on general obligation debt. High-profile TIF and economic development projects with long payback. Oshkosh Corp, that's the hotel, aviation business park. Once we made that investment, we borrowed $2 million for the aviation business park. It's going to take a long time to get that back. That's the risk that we assume when we do those types of things. Anytime we have matching funds for grants, when we say we're going to accept $1 million grant for the Riverwalk, well, it's not costing us $1 million. It's costing us more than $1 million, and we got to borrow for that. And then when we use 10-year debt to fund capital outlay, again, it's dangerous in the long run.
Mark,
So
when you say using 10-year notes to fund capital outlay, it's more in line with what we've done the past few years, is where we've put $1 million in for things that really don't qualify, for lack of a better term, to be funded with debt. They should be funded with cash because of the you create a life cycle, a lifespan, instead of actually using reality. What a real lifespan is, and those should be funded with ongoing
Why don't you look, okay?
cash as opposed to debt.
Oh, sure.
Is that correct?
It is correct. In fact, I'm asking Trina to go look in the book so we can show you that that's what we've done, and we're proposing to do more of it next year because as we've been looking at these things, this is where a fresh set of eyes looking at it saying, look, if you're serious about that point, we got to do more of it. And so we're not just saying 10-year, we're saying, 15-year life, should you really be borrowing for 10 years or should you be paying cash? And if we use general obligation debt for things that are legally okay, but still just barely. They're competing with traditional geo debt. We can't pay cash for big street projects that Public Works are doing. That's just not sustainable. We do borrow for some of that stuff. So we have to say, we got to start putting cash into some of this stuff so that we can dedicate our borrowing for truly long-term investment.
Probably a good analogy if you'd break it down to how, as people often say, the city should operate like households do. It would be like similar to using your credit card that you're paying 21% debt on to pay for your gasoline and your everyday expenses in your car. It doesn't make financial sense because over time you're drawing down your ability when you need debt to borrow it. At the same time, you're also paying interest on something that you consume immediately.
Okay, yeah, why don't you, what page are they on?
2015 page -12. A really good example of this is the concrete pavement repairs. This is something that is done annually, and it's really just repairing the concrete. It's not adding sufficient life, but it's more of a annual expense. However, we are including it into our CIP every year.
So what we're proposing to do is, we should be paying cash for that. We shouldn't be borrowing for that type of thing. So we've gone a little past what we've done in recent years, and that's why we're proposing actually more than $1 million. It's what, closer to $1.3 million?
Yes.
When all is said and done.
Yep.
A couple other examples. What page you on?
Thinking equipment as well.
Yeah, equipment, very much so. You know, it's interesting. Dave's garbage trucks and recycling trucks, we know because of the beating that garbage trucks take, they don't last 10 years. So when we buy them, we're paying cash for those. We cannot borrow for those by law because we know for every reason that those things are never going to last 10 years. We always replace them within 10.
So do we geo our, just last night we approved the cold mix asphalt, but yet we assess our citizens, so they could go out quite a few years to pay that off, right? But
Yes.
do we bond for that, or do we geo debt it?
Fortunately, we, for those cold mix, that's been out of Dave's operating budget. Remember that?
Yeah.
That's good news. Thanks for giving me a softball that I was able to pitch back to you. That we have been taken out of their operating budget. Remember, we were talking about the fuel costs, but we still decided we wanted to do it. That's one of the few exceptions that we're doing it the right way, for lack of a better term. But it's like that concrete repair, we need to be paying cash for that stuff.
That's that, like we do when we approve, 20 slabs of concrete in the north side of the city, 20 on the, those are all sewer main breaks and water main break repairs mostly.
Why don't you come on up, Dave? Your time is coming, so you may as well come on up here and join us. Steve, why don't you come up too?
I mean, is this more a bigger project than
Yes,
just that?
They do major patching on a street like Keller Street. It's specifically to do repairs on Arterial and Collector Street. So when the DOT was working on Highway 21 at Highway 41, but we had some work on Oshkosh Ave in that same area that was outside their limits, but it made it into a project for concrete patching.
So in the past, we've been borrowing for that. You're saying now you want to put it in our general operating budget.
Right, because I think we got to go back to some basics and say there's certain things we need to pay cash for. That will, by definition, reduce our borrowing. Now, what that means is we got to pay cash for it, but we should have been doing that all along. And I know that we are not alone, and I think that was what Tom was kind of referring to as professional finance folks have been getting together. They're all lamenting the fact that, I think we've dipped into this borrowing well a little too much. For us, it's really coming to roost. For those folks who listen to us, they're saying, we got to make sure we don't get ourselves in that situation where we're trying to get below a threshold. 70% is a pretty high threshold. I mean, It's enough to keep us in, it was enough that when we were doing it, we got in AA2. So we want to stay in that good company, and the only way we can stay in that good company is getting back to 70%.
The other we've talked about this is cash versus leasing of equipment, and then also with state contracts for things such as squad cars, do we have to pay cash when we do that, or are we borrowing money to pay technically cash on the state contract?
With police cars, we pay cash because we're lucky if we get 5 years out of them. If you're talking about pickup trucks, in some cases, we've assigned a life of a pickup truck of 10 years. Now, I have a 10-year-old truck, but I'm telling you that our folks use it a lot more intensely. Although my kids give it a run, it's not the same as day after day, heavy usage, heavy equipment, constantly running because of a variety of things. They take a beating. For us to assign 10 years, I think is a little questionable. But legally, are we doing it? Yeah, because we let them go 10 years, and then they're literally, the wheels are ready to fall off when we're there. If we buy cash for those things, and the wheels do proverbially fall off, we know we've at least paid cash for it. And then we go back and we pay cash for it again. For us to lose a car after 9 years and borrow 10 years, that's not sustainable. We can't do that. And that's why these marginal ones, 10 years and so on, I think Trina has a few more examples. What page are
The 2015-49. The one thing that I will note is the items that we have identified that are more relative and more appropriate for cash funding, those items will not be shifting back to the operations budget. Those are actually going to stay in the capital fund, however, be cash funded. We wanted to be cognitive, and we need to be aware of the expenditure restraint. And so by switching, it's not possible to switch those back to a general operations budget.
So how are you going to identify them so that we know the separation?
And so that's a really good question. So if you look at 2015-50, if you look at the sources and funds, you'll see that we have general fund, city contribution, and a utility fund contribution. That is meant to set out that those are items that will be paid for in cash.
Okay.
Are those contributions come from the general fund, though?
Yep. When you levy the tax, when the council approves the budget and levies a tax, that'll include that money in there. It goes through the general fund before it gets onto this page, but we got to start doing more of it. And Tom mentioned the million. It's going to be more like $1.3 million.
So off this equipment page, we have $20,000 of general fund items that are going to be cash funded. And then we have the utility funds that are also doing a cash concept, and they have items that equate or equal to $389,000.
You have another example? Because I was like, only 20. I know that you've got more in there that are better than that. But the point is that we're going to use more cash than we have in the past. I think a lot of property improvements, if you go through the document, maybe that'll, just in the interest of time, as you go through the document, you're going to see more of this because philosophically we think that's how we're going to get ourselves down to 70%. Oh, what page?
2015-12, the public infrastructure improvements, other streets. That, when we already spoke about it, the concrete pavement repairs, we had the $150,000. So we're going to do $142,500 in cash outlay for that.
So those are examples, and you're going to see those.
For example, so with that being said, then, what other area of the budget then will be affected by that since we're paying more cash?
Well,
roughly, I mean, you don't have to go into great detail at this point, but
that's where we're going to have to balance the general fund by put $300,000 more cash into the capital projects fund. And if we have to make sacrifices on the operating budget, I think we need to do it. And that'll be our challenge. And when you get the budget in the next two and a half weeks, you're going to see that $1.3 million Plus or minus, you're going to see that number in there. This isn't the final version, but it's pretty close to the final version. A few little tweaks here and there, but we're pretty much there.
Probably the another really good example is on 2015-35. It's traffic improvements. So it's traffic signal equipment, LED replacement, install pedestrian countdown signal heads. Those would be items that we have traditionally included into our CIP borrowing. However, in looking at changing some of our philosophy and our methodology, we're seeing it more appropriate to now utilize cash for those items.
Mark, follow up on Steve's question. What was, how much did we take out of that fund last year? How much we pay in cash last year?
$1 million. It was $1 million.
We got 300,000, so you're saying it goes to $1.3 million, so 300,000 is coming out of other things.
2 years ago, it was $1.2 million.
Not $1.3 million, but 300,000 is.
300, okay.
2 years ago, it was $1.2 million. We knocked it down to $1 million. Now we're knocking it back up to $1.3 million.
So really, in the past, when we borrowed long-term for these items that were actually short-term lived assets, previous councils had basically kind of done a shell game in that they were pushing off, they were acquiring things but pushing off the payment for them to future years and adding interest along with that payment rather than biting the bullet and saying, look, we need to put this onto the levy and possibly increase taxes at that point, which would have been a more financially prudent thing than to be kind of shifting it to a, kind of not having some political backbone, I think is really what I'm saying. And I understand all of us are here, we understand the issue, and we're cleaning it up right now. But I think that's one thing that needs to be understood is that in the past, to be kind of cheap, we weren't fiscally prudent.
We all own that.
We all own it now.
Staff owns it as well. I mean, and I would say, as Tom was pointing out earlier, Tom Carmen, a lot of other communities were doing this too. And it's like, if we're really going to be truthful to ourselves, we gotta.
Right, we have to address it now. But what I'm getting at is that previous councils who held up the banner of keeping your taxes low and fiscally prudent were actually kind of shifting it to a future, kicking it down the road, kicking the can down the road, I think is the best term.
Trying to put a positive spin on
we're
that.
working on it, though. We're working on it. We're admitting, first thing we need to do to fix a problem is admit you have a problem, and I'm glad we've admitted to that problem.
And now the next one is to get us to.
The good news is
we got a plan.
Windows professional.
Oh, you got to wake the thing up? Yeah. Okay. I think Trina gave you a handout for this as well because it doesn't always show up real well on the screen, and we added some footnotes to it as well. And let's see.
Oh, you're going back.
Oh, I'm going back? Well, that's why it's not coming up. There we go. That doesn't do justice very well. But what we've done is give you some historical perspective on where our debt situation is, where the percentage has been, where it went, and now how we're going to turn the corner. And essentially how we're going to turn the corner is by capping our annual borrowing at $11.4 million. And by doing that, we will get ourselves back to close to 70% by 2020, below 70% by 2021, but we're really going to be hugging around 70%. So we have to maintain that 11.4 for the duration of the next decade to maintain that 70%. It really is as simple as you got to pay off more than you're borrowing. It really is that simple. And you can see that when we did more borrowing, the percentage went up. When we borrow less and pay off more, the percentage goes down. So you can see that beginning in 2015, we're going to be paying off, retiring $13.6 million, but we're going to be only taking on 11.4. That $2.2 million differential will knock us down 1%. And then you'll see about 1%, 1.5% every year until we get ourselves down to 70%. Trina?
One of the assumptions, though, is and I know that this is not going to be the absolute silver bullet to do it, but equalized value is staying the same. which, if we can increase equalized value over this period of time, it makes the situation much better. But the thing is equalized value is still a static figure. And hopefully with Go EDC and the investments we're making in the airport industrial park and these other things, that we will see equalized value go up, which would either drive the number down, the percentage down much faster, or we could also then seek to invest in the city and still maintain that glide path down to 70%, correct?
Yes. Now, that you segued right to Trina's. Go ahead.
This is a very conservative analysis, and the reason it's conservative is because we have held equalized value constant all the way 2015 through 2024. That is a very conservative. We have lost equalized value the past few years, but many communities are now seeing the trend shift, and they're starting to see the rises in their equalized value, and I would anticipate here in Oshkosh that we would see that as well. And you're exactly right, that gain in equalized value either opens the door to reduce our debt limit even lower, faster, or it allows us to put additional money in infrastructure investment to help encourage that development.
And do we think by doing this too that our bond rating could possibly go back up, which would reduce a little bit of what we pay in borrowing? Or not?
Always a goal.
Always
And I think what the beauty of this discussion tonight is when we meet with Moody's next week to get ready for our borrowing, we're going to share this with them. Now, I think their reaction will be, this looks very good, keep it up. That's it. It's going to be, okay.
I mean, it's not going to happen overnight, obviously. But I think anytime you put a plan together, a plan of action together, and if you show that you can stay with it, I think that's important. It goes back to our compensation study we had for salaries. He said we have to stay with it. To make it work, we got to stay with it. So it's the same thing here. I think if we got a plan, future councils, whether I'm on the council or any of our other fellow council members are on it, they got to really make a commitment to this too. Because if all of a sudden 2, 3, 4 years from now, they go, well, we're going back to what Tom was saying, we're just going to pass the buck down because we want to be fiscal conservatives. Then it's not helping anybody. It's just putting us back in the same problem we had before.
I had asked Trina to run a number, and it was kind of anticipation of your question, Tom. If we just had 2% growth in equalized value, we'd get to this in 4 years. And if we maintain 2%, now this is very Pollyannish, but if we got 2% growth starting now and still capped it at 11.4, by 2024, we'd be down to just under 58%.
That's almost to the gold standard.
It doesn't take a lot of growth, but we just haven't had the benefit of it. So economic development is a key part of this, but we've got to be fiscally conservative. So I share the Pollyannish, but I didn't share you a copy because I don't want you to, hey, you said, because we're saying we're going to say 0. And if we do better, great.
You're saying with economic development, it takes some big hits, not little bitty things, but it's some major touchdowns. I mean,
but also economic development is also making a little bit of progress all the time. But our values have been going down. Tom Carmen pointed out, the state assesses manufacturing property. We have zero control over that. And these numbers have been going down. Some commercial properties have been going down, not as much, but industrial properties have been going down in value. And that's a large part of this reduction. I mean, it's been, since 2009, it's been $50 million. Our equalized value's gone down. That's not because things have shuttered. It's because they've just been revalued. And that's been a hit to us.
is there a method to the state's madness for doing this? I mean, there's some reason behind it.
Just shifting the burden, that's all.
Or is it to be a more tax-friendly state to do business in?
I think that's a good conversation for elected officials to have. How's that for a punt on that one?
I think the last point to make on this is we didn't get where we are overnight, and we're not going to get to where we want to be overnight. It is going to take time, but we have to stay focused and committed to this plan. And
Okay. Trina's going to get going, so we can spend a little time with Dave and Steve. They did come for a reason.
So this is just a really good graphic representation of where we have came from, where we've peaked, and where we truly, as long as we adhere and we stay on this plan, where we can really end up in the actual curve of what we can accomplish in the next 10 years.
Now we're getting closer to where we are with the 2015 CIP. So this is what we're planning to do as far as borrowing goes.
So currently in the CIP that you have received, however, it is not the final document. The current amount of dollars that we have put into borrowing are $11,358,100, which left us with approximately $42,000 under the cap of the $11,400,000. There will be some adjustments to that yet, where it's going to increase by the $30,000. So that's already up to about $72,000 that dollars that have not been spoken for or planned to be borrowed for. This would line up this chart with what's in your current CIP book. So what we wanted to summarize to you is that the current 2015 CIP plan does meet the borrowing cap of the $11,400,000. We also have a goal of establishing the base borrowing of the $11,400,000 in the years 2015 through 2020 to sustain the goal of obtaining the 70% borrowing capacity. Monies that are levied, also we like to refer to as cash, are being applied to items that are considered for maintenance and reoccurring, or items that just don't have that 10 years of life. And finally, we have not established an equipment replacement fund. That is something that is a good goal to obtain. However, the vision to get to that equipment replacement fund, much like our debt plan, is a long-term goal and a plan that is something that we can look at and obtain, but it will take some long-term planning.
Is that something that you're looking as a policy direction through the council or approved by council, Mark or Trina, or how do you?
we're actually addressing
Hold
that.
two
That's-
slides.
all
We
right.
got two slides.
Okay, all right. Then
Your
I'll-
answer is
I'll
coming in
wait.
2
I'll wait,
slides.
All right.
because
I'll
I
wait.
have part of that answer as well.
Okay.
So again, in what you will receive next month, your final CIP document will meet the borrowing of the $11,400,000 for 2015 and 2016. If you look in your current version, you'll see that 2016 does not meet that $11,400,000 currently, but in your final version, it will meet that. We do feel that this 2-year projection will be beneficial for current and future financial operational planning. And in your final CIP, your street projects also will be balanced to $3,800,000 through 2016 through 2019. When we started talking about long-term goals, one benchmark that we thought it would be helpful to establish was how much were we going to put in streets because of the impact and the planning that's needed, which Steve and Dave will go into further. And finally, non-street projects such as equipment and infrastructure improvements, 2017 and 2000 through 2019 are being considered very fluid and difficult to anticipate due to changing circumstances and priorities. So what we're trying to say here is essentially we could balance 2017 through 2019 to the $11,400,000. However, it would be purely an analytical and number exercise.
Okay. So going to the point that Mr. Herman brought up a moment ago, during the last budget workshop, we had council identified the need for guidelines for the CIP. And these are things that we think might be appropriate to refer to the Long Range Finance Committee. We're doing some of it. You're going to see some of it. And we're going to talk about some of this in a little bit. But prioritizing projects, even how to prioritize projects, 2-year budgeting of the CIP. Take a look at that. We think that that is something that has a lot of value. Still do the 5-year plan, but do a 2-year budget. Now, when you do a 2-year budget, much like the state does, you readjust for the second year, but you kind of get yourself honed in for those 2 years. I think for Public Works, it would make a lot of sense. I mean, they're effectively having to do it anyway. So actually it would probably make it easier for them to even go to a 2-year budget. And then using the levy, how do we use the levy? How much more? Did we go far enough? I think you could make a case that we didn't go far enough. I think the Long Range Finance Committee can take a look at that. And then developing the equipment replacement fund. That's something that we talked about, that $1 million contribution as being equipment replacement fund. It really isn't. It's really just a cash contribution. That's a great start, but if we really want to develop something that develops a sinking fund for equipment replacement, we got to start having that conversation, and I think that's where Vinny takes over.
Equipment replacement fund is already on the to-do list of long-range finance. And, you know, the 2-year budgeting of CIP has been discussed as well. You know, long-term planning and kind of so we can focus on really where we're at. But the ERF is definitely on in the playbook, so to speak.
Very good. The other thing that council has given us a pretty clear direction on is, can you just tell us how and why you're prioritizing the projects you do? And that's been a huge issue. So what we did was we went back as we were going through the CIP and said, why are we doing what we're doing? And some of it's somewhat intuitive, but in reality, we've been doing this all along. So we wanted to share with you some of the things. You're going to see this. You will see at least one of these elements in everything in the CIP. There were the highest priority ones, and we just internally just call them, we got to do. We got to do these projects. Now, there's a variety of reasons that they're determined that we've got to do them. Imminent failure or in critical need of replacement is kind of a no-brainer. It's very obvious that when you've got imminent failure, Mount Vernon, the street on the east side of the library, aside from the fact that the road isn't in very good condition, the sewer is failing, and it's ancient. So that rose Mount Vernon to the top of the list. That's why it's a gotta do. Contractual obligations and deadlines, any type of obligation we have with developments, through a development agreement with TIFs, those are things that we got to do if we've already committed to them. Previously established long-term commitments. They may or not be contractual. One example of that is the Taking Root program. It's only $25,000, but we made a long-term commitment. 2015 represents year 6 of a 6-year commitment. So we will have fulfilled that commitment. But when there is some value to saying a handshake means something, we made that agreement with the Community Foundation 6 years ago, and we're going to follow through with it. Required for maintaining grant eligibility. If we said we applied for a grant and we got the award, we can't just say, okay, we'll take the money but not fulfill the grant requirements. You've got to deliver on those things. Adherence to equipment replacement schedules. it's not so much that it's 20 years, the bell goes off, we automatically replace it. When we talk about transit, you're going to see that we have 10 vehicles that are due for replacement. They were all purchased in the 2003, 2004 timeframe. By definition, they're all coming due. Instead of denying and saying, well, we'll just wait until they fall apart, we can't wait for that. We need to start replacing those. We're going to replace the worst first, and then we'll slowly replace them. The idea there, just a real brief one, and I'm giving you little insights into the CIP, but what we're doing is 2 and 15, 3 and 16, 3 and 17, 2 and 18. Now that's fluid, that can change. If they're looking like they're doing okay, the maintenance costs aren't going up, we may pull back on that, but over 4 years, we have to pretty much count on that we're going to have to replace these vehicles because history shows us that that's what happens to those types of vehicles. Anything with public and employee health, safety, and security kind of makes sense that you're going to be doing those things, especially if heating systems or other type of safety equipment or things like that. Literally, Dave, or actually more Kevin Ewan, I think Kevin has done it to scare me. He's taken me for a ride in vehicles that don't have a floorboard. And we're driving, and our employees are driving in those. Now, normally, I assume that they normally don't have the employees sitting on that side of the floorboard, or maybe they've lost them. I don't know. Kevin's not saying. But safety is, all kidding aside, is very serious. And then ensuring long-term infrastructure needs are met. Dave and Steve are here to talk about a couple of those because one that I'm going to point out to you is one that everybody knows needs to get replaced. You've had people come to you at a council meeting tell you this street needs to be replaced, and we're here to tell you it's in 2019. Why are we putting it in 2019 when it is so clearly in need of replacement? I always said it's not just what's on the surface, it's what's under the surface. And that's why Dave and Steve are here tonight to give you an overview of some of those things that we're doing with that. So streets are an example. And so the next slide takes this priority list and just applies it to streets. Imminent failure of street or utility, that's Mount Vernon. Interconnectivity of street or utility to larger project, that's Bowen Street. We did Bowen Street this year. We need to continue with Bowen Street, and that's where CP ties in. CP ties into Bowen Street. We can't do CP until we do Bowen, and they'll get into that a little later. Coordinated program of future CIP projects. If we know that we need to get certain portion of Bowen done, we got to do it in pieces. We can't do it all in 1 year. And then meeting long-term needs of larger street and utility systems. We're going to talk a little bit about Oregon Street. Oregon Street was not in the CIP last year. What's happened? Is it imminent failure? No, it's not imminent failure. It's looking at the long-term needs. When we started looking at the airport aviation business park, we analyzed it. We know we've got sufficient sewer capacity for the aviation business park. That's good news. But as other people started to take notice of our interest in the aviation business park, Public Works and Planning were getting queried about, well, what if we wanted to do something down there? Not necessarily full bore projects that they've got, but people are starting to inquire. And when people start to inquire, we have to give them answers. And Public Works analyzed it, and our sewer main is not sufficient to get there. And I'm going to leave it at that. But to make it sufficient, we've got to go all the way up Oregon, back up to where it taps into the treatment plant. So Oregon Street suddenly becomes a higher priority project. Those are the things that, when they start taking a look at system-wide issues, that's what happened with Bowen Street. That's what's happening with Oregon Street. Those are things we have to look at, because if we don't, 5 years from now, we'll say, well, why didn't we start on Oregon Street? Now it's imminent because we have a development project down there that we need to get done right away, and why didn't you guys think of that back in 14? Well, we're here to tell you we're thinking about it in 14. So those are some things that we've done. And then we have the other categories that we've done, and you're going to see these in the project, in the CIP. what I call need to do. Probably priority 2, if you want to call it that. But they're items at or nearing the end of their useful life with increasing non-value-added maintenance costs. Kevin Ewan has every vehicle monitored for maintenance cost. And you can see the maintenance costs go flat, and then all of a sudden, boom, they start going up. And we're paying money for vehicles that are going to be around in a couple years. And we're throwing good money after bad. So do you stop that bleeding by replacing these vehicles?
Mark, excuse me a second. Now, I know that several years ago, the police department went to that vehicle maintenance software where they were looking at preventive maintenance and kind of getting on things proactively. Do we have a similar program at Public Works with all of our other vehicles as well?
Yes, by vehicle, we keep track. Kevin, when every vehicle in the CIP, Kevin has analyzed it and shown me exactly how the maintenance costs have ramped up. And you can see it's in the healthcare industry, they talk about the most expensive years of your life are your last couple of years. Well, same applies to vehicles. The Quint that is in the fire department, Quint, Chief Franz does the exact same thing. We spent $45,000, I'm sorry, I'm thinking of another number, $35,000 on maintenance for that Quint this year, just to keep it on the street. That's just ridiculous when you think about what we would have to pay for it. For $1 million Quint over 20 years is only $50,000. We're paying $35 just to keep it alive. We should put $50 and have a reliable vehicle that they're not questioning whether or not they do it. The other Quint isn't as bad, and that's why it's in 16. So that's where it's nearing the end of its useful life and increasing non-value-added maintenance. It meets that criteria dead on. We want to adhere to replacement schedule. This is kind of like the other transit vehicles. We want to avoid a log jam because we don't want to have to replace. We cannot replace 8 buses at one time. We have to stretch this out. So what we do is we take a look at the maintenance record and say which one is the best candidate to be retired. Not which is the oldest, because it's not just age that determines it, it's health. I hate to use a healthcare analogy, but that really is what we're talking about. And then staying ahead of things so that we avoid putting it on a gotta-do list. Because once it's on a gotta-do list, we're doing it. Every street project in the CIP is a gotta-do. Every street project in the 2015, and I would say 16, and I would say virtually everything on the list. CP is a gotta-do, but we got to do other ones first, and we have to do it in a methodical fashion. So that's the thought process that we've gone through.
One comment about equipment and maintenance. I mean, most companies that offer extended warranties, they know down. I mean, that is so scientific. They know exactly through warranty claim something is going to start to fail. So I would think Kevin, with some of our vendors, could work with them, get their information. They know when these things are going to fail. I mean,
I believe we, as part of our purchases, we look at
okay.
But
But with Mercury, when we first got into extended warranties probably 27 years ago, it was such a phenomenal moneymaker because we knew exactly the failure rates through warranty claims. So I'm hoping with our vendors that somehow they will share, I mean, you said the contract, something where they share some of this information with us. I may not want to, but I think we should try for it. They have it.
To go back to your analogy, though, the healthiness stuff, take CP, for example. We know now it's 4 or 5 years. Isn't there something we can do better than throwing tar and gravel in a hole that doesn't work? Can't we put a better patch out there? Can't we do something on some of those rougher streets that will last? Not a complete cold mix asphalt, but something better than, what we're doing. I mean,
well, the question really would be is the procedures you have now is you make people pay. So I know there's been some talk about what Appleton did, having
Wheel tax.
Create some sort of fund to pay for some sort of
He
maintenance.
said it,
That's a
not me.
different issue, but, I mean, that's really a question, because people, even the cold mix program that got approved last night, it has a minimum life of 5 years. I keep telling people, it's lasted way longer than that. You know, the first program we did in '98, we, still have many, or if not all of those streets out there. But all they understand is the 5 year. They don't want to pay for a 5 year. And so if you're making people pay for something and then make
Turn
them
around and
pay
assess them again.
Right.
Well, let's just throw that theory out there. I'm not a big proponent of a wheel tax, but I do support our assessment program for total street reconstruction. What about a minimal wheel tax for strictly a street maintenance program? Years ago, I can remember as a kid, we used to throw tar and gravel down to extend the life of some streets, and they smoothed out and did okay. And then, but at the same time, some of these streets lead to the Leach, lead to our parks, lead to the Grand, and it's like driving down shuffleboards. Yeah, we're not going to do the street for 5 more years, so we expect people to drive on that stuff for 5 more years. There's got to be a way of either moving monies somewhere that would let you put a blacktop patch on there that'll last 3 or 4 or 5 years. I mean, for example, Broad Street, when we had that incident with the skid steer digging the holes, you came in, dug it down, put a nice patch over a street that was already a cold mix asphalt. That turned out fine. Even part of Bowen Street, where they had to kind of tie into the concrete, not just with the storm water, they were able to come in and do a pretty nice patch. Can't we do that on some of these? I mean, maybe it's only a block, but we do that instead of,
I kind of have two answers. One is, if it's going to imminently be done in 5 years, truthfully being done in 5 years, not we hope it's done in 5 years, we know it's going to be, then it's a judgment call.
right?
If we are not as convinced, and we know that we have a street that, we know the street's in poor condition, but the utilities, if they got a little life in them, can we extend those lives a little longer? Can we buy ourselves 10 years or even 15 years and then put that farther down the road on a full replacement? But as Dave points out, the people don't like that 5-year guarantee.
Not if we
because
do
they
assessments.
They only hear 5-year and they hear assessments, and then they get back-to-back assessments. So whether it's wheel tax or other funding sources, maybe that's something long-range finance can take a look at and say, look, what's fair, what's appropriate, what's financially viable.
Well, and maybe the other option too would be to look at what are other communities that are somewhat in our situation, not so much size even, but situation. What are they doing with some of those beat up streets? How are they dealing with those issues? Good example, Pinoca, just a small stretch to the golf course is nothing but landmines between 2 streets, Graham and I forget what the other one is. The rest of the street's pretty good, but that one block is just terrible. And yet, how many thousands of cars drive there to the golf course in a season? And yet, what do they see? That one stretch that is, and you see everybody, and I go there quite often because I'm in 2 golf leagues. You see cars driving all over the place to get away from the potholes. And it's one block. We can't fix that one block with something.
Yeah. Right now, we don't have the financial resources to do it, and that's where we got to take a look at, should we be applying financial resources to extend those lives, and then it's sort of a triage unit. It's like, okay, we'll take care of you with a patch, and we'll move on. The potholes, I know, we've had plenty of conversations, Steve, over
I'm
that.
a pothole guy.
Yeah, it's a good thing to be a pothole guy. I mean, and it's something we got to take a look at.
It's the most visible to citizens,
Well,
I think, of anything in the
I'll
community.
just
It's
put it
out
this-
of everything
yeah.
that we do and talk
I have a
about.
2010 truck. I had to put new tires on it, and I had to get a front wheel alignment. So that's within 4 years of a brand new vehicle. And I drive 90% of it in the city of Oshkosh. Not looking for potholes, but
Ouch.
yeah, ouch.
Well said. I wanted to make sure I did the last slide. We talk about should-dos. You hear a lot about cultural, recreational, educational facilities. They are not health and safety. but they are certainly assets in our community. There are libraries, our museums. We've made a commitment. The museum's celebrating its 90th year. If we're going to continue to have a library, if we're going to continue to have a museum, we need to make sure that those facilities are done. A roofing project's in the CIP. Why? Because it's in imminent need of repair. But it's more than just that. So this is in the should-do category. If we're going to have a library, if we're going to have a museum, if we're going to have good parks, we should do these things to maintain them. Neighborhood development and improvement, that's basically what council has been saying the last few years. Is that health and safety? Well, it depends on who you talk to. For some people, it is about health and safety. For a lot of people, they may not see it that way. So it's in there. We should do. Why? Because other people view it as health and safety. Avoidance of increased maintenance costs, kind of repetitive. Adherence to recommended replacement schedules. We're not, saying it's imminent failure, but if we got 10 vehicles that need to get replaced over the next 4 years, we got to put them somewhere. And maybe they don't have to go in year 1, but they're going to have to go in year 2, 3, 4, or 5. Meeting other goals of the city's strategic plan, which you will be getting soon, but you know what you prioritize in the strategic there are not going to be any big surprises, but we got to meet the goals of the plan, neighborhoods, financial, etc. And then avoid getting them back on the got-to-do list. We need to do these ones, we should do these ones, because we don't want to get at that point where it hits that spike on the maintenance curve. So with that, I would like Dave and Steve to go over what they're looking at. You going to bring it up here, Dave? Yeah. Okay. This is in your document, but it doesn't do as much justice, and I know council last year enjoyed looking at this.
Okay, so it should be the first, I think it should be the first page of your document. And we had to shrink it down to get all the variety of projects on the west, north, and south sides of the city. So we thought it'd be easier to talk about some of the issues Mark had tried to explain a little bit, some of the prioritization of a project. So I think, the one example that came up, if you looked at last year's map as opposed to this year's map, you would have seen almost a straight line of color on Bowen Street. Well, we still have sections of Bowen Street on our list. They're in the 2020, 2021 years. They didn't make the first 5 years. But an example that Mark had talked about was this section of CP Avenue east of Bowen Street. Everybody knows it's in bad shape.
Show them the black, because it sometimes doesn't show up. A portion of CP has that black line.
Which we have the black lines indicate locations that under the pavement management system are rated 1, which is failed, 2, 3, which is the poor and very poor. So one goal is to try to make sure we're taking care of those black lines. But in this example, we knew we had to start at the river with our storm sewer on Bowen Street, and we brought that up to the area of Otter Avenue. And then I was questioning Steve what was going on here. Well, another project we had to do was Bayshore. Me not understanding that on CP Avenue, the sanitary sewers drain in 2 directions. So to do the whole stretch of sanitary sewer on CP and pave it, you have to actually also fix the sanitary sewer on Bayshore and on Lake Street, which is why you're seeing the 2016, 2017, 2018 projects, and then you can get a 19 project on CP because all the utilities are able to be fixed. So you had a question, Steve, about a project out here by Pinoqua.
Yeah.
That's actually a paving project, and the type of issues we run into, so here's a situation where we did dredging on Sawyer Creek.
Right.
Because of that, we impacted a river crossing, a sanitary sewer that crossed the river, and now we're looking at having to relocate it to Westfield. Luckily, Westfield is a street in poor condition, but to
I don't
get
think you
to...
meant to say it that way. Luckily, it's a poor street.
Luckily for us, we don't want to be digging, we don't want to dig up brand-new streets. That's the question, are you digging up brand-new streets? So we had done a bridge project over on Westfield at Sawyer Creek, anticipating extending utilities. And so we have a project to repave the street, redo the utilities. Then we will have additional utility projects in this area, and finally a paving project on Panoqua. So it all goes in a sequence of planning. Steve has all these documents where he's looking at things like James is looking at storm sewer, Steve is looking at sanitary sewer and the water mains. But another example that Mark talked about was, if you remember, we had the EPA talk to us about our sanitary sewers. Part of the resolution to that.
Oh, I guess you need to, so they can see them.
I'm sorry, was that we needed to do some modeling of our system, check the capacities. As part of that modeling, it determined that we had some issues and were able to resolve some problems by working on Oregon Street. So all of a sudden, we had two priorities come out of that modeling. One was a project out here on Snell Road with some interceptors, which we have funded this year, out by the prison site. The second priority was Oregon. So if you take a look at the last 5-year map compared to this 5-year map, you'll say, wow, there's tremendous changes. And that's, some of the things just happen. We get more information and we realize we have to change priorities. Another good example Mark talked about was Mount Vernon. I mean, we had Parkway. It was on your last year's list. The engineers came into me 2 months ago, and they were just shaking because they did additional televising, found, as Mark indicated, we have some 1890s sanitary sewer, and they were just petrified of going through this winter about the collapses, which might happen. So it's like it became a huge priority. It moved right up to the list of being done next year. We knew we had to do Parkway, but really it became we had to do Mount Vernon, and to get Mount Vernon done, we have to run the sewer down Parkway. So
Now, that being said, Dave, when we readjust, or your department readjusts and shifts, do we send letters back out to those homeowners that thought their street was going to get done, say, in 2015, and now they got moved to 2016 or 17? Do we notify them so that they're aware of
last year,
the change?
what we did was, when we had streets that we anticipated being in the 14 program, all those people that didn't make it, we sent a letter out to them and said, we had anticipated that your location was going to be worked on in 14, and we're writing you to tell you that it couldn't be included in the budget.
Yeah. And the only reason I say that is, again, for those that are budgeting, maybe putting money aside, anticipating their assessment and everything, that gives them a little more time or changes their priorities.
We specifically did that last year.
Okay.
We'll have to look at it.
I think it needs to be done. And now in this case, where you move Mount Vernon to the top and something else got pushed back.
If we've notified them in the past that the street was coming, we send them a notice.
Okay.
If they've done the research on their own to figure it out, we're not necessarily reaching out. So
Okay.
we don't know,
Yeah.
how many people are looking out there. But if we've notified them their street is coming and we change it, we send them a notice.
Okay, very good.
If they've collected that on their own.
No, I just think that's just a courtesy thing more than anything.
And we will be having actually the last week in October is a very busy week, at least for us, because Monday is going to be the neighborhood meeting for the capital improvement program. So we weren't able to get it at the senior center. It will be here at City Hall, and we'll be inviting all the residents on the 4 projects that are included this year to give them information about paving and sidewalks and all those different questions they have. But that's a good question you had. We did send letters out last year and say, you know, we had anticipated you were going to be in the program, just as to let you know you're not in the program.
No, we've been very aggressive the last 3, 4, 5 years since I've been in council with detention ponds, some wet, some dry. Overall, this summer, we've had a lot of rain. Are you satisfied that they're working and they're meeting your expectations? And I didn't get any calls or emails that, geez, flooded basements, issues. So overall, are you comfortable that it's working?
You can never say that you're done, but you're right. We made a lot of progress since, say, 2009. Spent a lot of money, but I think it shows with areas that used to flood that don't flood. I mean, even what happened in 2008, there were people. So, for instance, the Melvin Avenue pump station. You know, I had worked here for 10 years at that time, and until those residents came in, it wasn't on any list because they hadn't had flooding. But after 8, they came back out and said, hey, and we did some more analysis and said, there's terrible problems out here. It got added to a list.
Good.
So I guess in a nutshell for this presentation, it was like, if you want to see changes, there are tremendous changes from the last year's 5-year plan to this year's 5-year plan. But
The interconnectedness with CP, again, to highlight, we need to get some of Bowen Street done, and that can't get done until 16. And then Bay Shore 17, what is it, in 18? The
Lake
This
is
is
18.
Lake.
Lake Street in 18. So when somebody asks why, well, we don't deny. In fact, you can see a good part of CP has a black line on it too. So it's not that we don't. We're not denying that that CP is a problem, but if we're going to do it right, we got to make sure we do it all. It does beg the question that you bring up, Steve. Is like, what are you going to do in the meantime? How much money do you put into it, knowing that you're going to dig it all up? I think looking ahead, maybe not looking ahead at CP, but looking ahead of projects that are not on this list. Is there something we can do to put some blacktop on those, get a good cold mix? It gives us,
Or the question might be a paver. You know, if you pave a typical residential street, you have 2 halves. Well, it might be an idea, and what I'm thinking of is a street like New York Avenue by Merrill School. A 12-foot pass down the middle would take care of a lot of those problems. That we wouldn't assess it, but it would come out of an operating budget to pay for some maintenance.
Yeah. Maybe, what about traffic counts on certain streets and say, okay, if it exceeds XYZ amount of cars, we'll do something. I mean, I don't know. I'm just throwing out ideas.
Oh, these are...
And just because I'm sure some people watching TV are going to say, what's the pink area? Is that the airport?
Oh, the pink
zone?
area, is the sidewalk reconstruction area where we monitor for bad sidewalks.
Okay. And we do that, that's kind of like shifts all over the city.
It's a 10-year program, and every year there's a different section of the map that's
We were
highlighted.
north of Witzel this year. We're north of Witzel this year.
So, again, I keep going back to last year's plan, but what really happened with last year's plan is all the streets, or almost all the streets that were listed in 18 and 19, because of some changes, ended up being in 20. So we've had a lot of changes. It's not that we forgot about those streets. I think Steve actually has. This is a plan you see, but I think in his mind he's got a 6 to 10 year plan also. So there's always things that are on a list. They're always in some fashion being thought about.
And to their credit, once we were honing in on the 11.4 million, and we discussed 3.8, a full third dedicated to streets, they've pretty much got the 3.8 identified in every year of the CIP. Even though we're saying we want to be fluid, they're planning, because every time you move a piece of the puzzle, they have to reshuffle everything. So if we had 5 years of guaranteed funding and we knew everything we knew today, this is what we would do. Next year, when we're here doing the same presentation, Dave will say, you may recall last year, things will change, but this is our best belief on what our priorities should be.
And you'll see projects. So I I think there's been emails, there was some questions, we were trying to get money from FEMA for the harsh winter, but we have streets where it was so cold and the sanitary sewers were so shallow, they froze solid. I mean, people had backups because the line was flat, it was full of water, it froze solid. When we cleaned it out, the line broke, so we have some projects in there that we have to repair or replace those lines. It's unfortunate, but, you know, back in the 60s or 50s, they put those lines in too shallow, and now we're replacing them.
And we have 3.8 we've allocated to streets this year. Part of our issue this year
No,
is the city.
not until 16.
Not till 16. Okay, so that's after the garage.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Let me give you an
Because
example.
After the garage, we get a little.
Then we're back on 11.4, 3.8 dedicated to streets, and you see there's a little more color in the latter years because of that 3.8, because we don't have as much this year. So our street program, what you see in red there, is pretty limited. Just
In
wanted
essence, it's Mount Vernon, Parkway, New York, and we had a petition on Custer.
One of the things, you know, when you talk about changing priorities, well, can I give you an example? I can give you a very easy example. Here's 9th Avenue. If somebody walked in tomorrow and said they wanted to develop the Pioneer Insight, we would probably look at redoing 9th in this area and extend it in there. But until such time that happens, these are our priorities. But those things can, and who doesn't wish for that to happen? So we know that we're going to want to do that, but there's no sense in us putting together plans or anything until we know
Well, I
that there's
believe it
something.
was on the 18 for last year, but then it got pushed off because there's just too many unknowns.
Yeah. It's 7 o'clock, Mr. Mayor. We're certainly happy to answer questions. You can see why we didn't want to get into the guts of the CIP because there was so much, but we thought that because streets are such a big part, understanding the method to that. But I would say if you go back and to the criteria that we use for gotta do, you can see that the thought process that Dave and Steve go through, this meets this criteria. Trina and I are talking about for next year to be more formal about this so we can show you. We've analyzed these and show you exactly how they measure up. But these are the common factors you see in the capital improvement plan. It's probably more a question of why isn't it on the gotta-do list rather than why is it on the gotta-do list. Every CIP that we have in there has a reason that meets at least one of these criteria, if not more. In streets, it meets probably 3 or more. Critical need, replacement schedules, health, safety, and security, long-term infrastructure needs. I mean, it's pretty obvious with streets. Other things, the departments can talk to you about those when we get to there, but Public Works is the lion's share of the CIP.
I think the only thing that I would add is we've kind of went over some methodology. One item that we are looking to hopefully implement into our 2016 CIP planning is hopefully a rating scale utilizing these same gotta do, should do, need to do, but have the departments involved in that rating so that helps give you guys additional information and additional benchmarks to see the system in working and how it's being utilized.
Thinking of something like a point system for various
Yes.
criteria.
Kinda like the
10
TIF.
10 points for each criteria and then have a total
Yep, weighting them a little bit perhaps, but yeah, it's that idea.
with
to
some
give-
weighting of the.
Yeah, it's not to make it a pass-fail, but to give you an idea that it does meet, one or more criteria. And with streets, it's pretty obvious. They meet up very easily. In fact, even the 2019s already meet up with that criteria.
Maybe we just ought to take a few minutes. I know it's a little bit after 7. If people have questions that have come up here to raise those questions.
I just have one question. This CIP is based on pretty much current economic conditions. Still kind of at the tail end of the little bit of a crash we had. what are our contingency? Should the economy take off, or should the economy slide backwards again? How fast can we react to some of this?
The sliding back is probably the tougher question, because usually the economy has a 2-year delayed reaction on our budget. So we would have to start planning for two years hence, because we would know that funding's going to be down. As far as ramping up, there is such a backlog of street projects. If we, we're talking about 3.8 million for streets. If we change the special assessment policy, not drastically, but more on funding end of things, because to get the fund, if there's other things we need to do, if we need to borrow for special assessments, that could impact things. Or if we reach a point where we need to do some more street projects, can we throw a couple more street projects in the 2016 plan because we need to, or the economy's favorable? If we get a 3% bump in equalized value, I'm coming back. Why? Because it'll be pointing us in the right direction. But that 70% goal that you set, you want to stay on that goal. And if things improve and we can do a little more and still meet the 5-year goal, I think Moody's would look upon that favorably. If we vary off that, they're going to say, tell us when you've got it maintained for 5 years. That's why Trina put it in for 10, because they want to see that we're going to walk this walk for a long time, not just, it's not a flavor of the day. It really is a long-term commitment.
To that, I think it was 2 years ago, we had some extra shovel-ready projects, and we got a couple of them done. So to Steve's comment, we probably would have something that we could put real quick together that Steve's probably got on the drawing boards. They're just sitting there.
One of the things in the CIP is planning and doing legwork for 2016 projects. Could we accelerate those? Yes. I love the optimism, and it's really good. Towards the end of all our work sessions, you guys come in with a sense of optimism, which I love, and I would love to have that problem. I'd love to challenge Steve with that. I think Steve would love to be challenged with that, and we'll be ready.
The economy has a tendency to do that without experience, where we have done forecasts for X, and it just takes off, and you're scrambling to. This is a manufacturing environment. You're scrambling to meet the needs.
Obviously, one thing we could always do is put more cash into projects right away. If we have more cash, put more cash and improve our bonding situation for the following year. You can always do that.
And the cash issue goes to Steve's point. If we can buy time on some of these street projects where the utilities aren't in imminent failure mode, there's no sense in doing those. We can just do the surface and throw a little cash that way. That would be another great approach to doing this, buying some time. You guys would love to have a little time bought.
Anybody else have a question? Sort of dying to ask since there's stuff brought up tonight. Okay, we got workshops for the 29th and 30th. What's the final budget workshop?
It will be the 5th. Mr. Peck, as chair of the Long Range Finance Committee,
Good man.
Made his declaration, and so we're planning for Wednesday, November 5th at 5 p.m. for the CIP, the CIP budget itself. You got a good, there isn't a heck of a lot that's going to change what Steve and Dave just showed you tonight. So that's as good as gold. There's a few little tweaks we need to make elsewhere, but the document you have is largely what you're going to see when we put together the one with the formal cover letter and a little more analysis. And we will balance the 2016. We think that that's really necessary, and to really start getting ourselves towards a two-year horizon on budgeting.
Anything else for the good of the order? If
Hope we met your expectations. Thank you.
Very nice.
Very good.
Thank
We're adjourned.
Very good. Thank you.
We're adjourned. So, thank you muchly.